Late August 1945, Tokyo Bay outskirts. 180 words. The truck engines cut their lights before reaching the hospital gate. American medics dismounted into silence. No sirens, no air raid alarms. Only the smell of burned timber drifting in from the city. The building ahead had once been painted white, marked with red crosses large enough to be seen from the air. Now the walls were cracked open. Windows were sealed with paper. Rainwater pooled on the floor where operating tables had stood. Inside, Japanese nurses waited in two narrow lines. Their uniforms were washed thin from years of shortages. Sleeves hid arms that shook from hunger. Some had not slept properly in weeks. They bowed in reflex when the foreign boots crossed the threshold, but no one spoke. The beds behind them were empty. Not because the wounded were healed, but because the wounded were gone. Records had been removed. Medicine cabinets stood hollow. The blackboard that once listed patient numbers had been wiped clean. One American doctor would later write that this was the quietest building he had entered during the entire Pacific War, a place where an empire had erased its own suffering. And it was in these corridors that the truth Japan had hidden for 8 years was about to surface. When Japan entered full-scale war with China in July 1937, the empire did not only mobilize armies. It mobilized language. The word Byoin, hospital, was redefined inside military doctrine as a place of restoration, not reckoning. Illness, breakdown, starvation, infection, psychological collapse. These are not to be recorded as failures of the state. They were classified as temporary conditions on the road to renewed sacrifice. By the late 1930s, every military hospital operated under two systems of documentation. One was clinical. It tracked amputations, gangrene cases, tropical disease outbreaks, and malnutrition. The second was ideological. It was the record sent upward to divisional headquarters, to Tokyo ministries, to the Home Ministry press offices. The second record never matched the first. Nurses were trained not merely in care, but in restraint. They learned how to adjust language in reports, how to avoid terms that suggested decay. A soldier who had lost half his body weight was not starving. He was exhausted by service. A ward that ran out of morphine was not undersupplied. It was adapting to circumstances. By 1941, after Pearl Harbor, this structure expanded across the Pacific. From Manila to Rabaul, from Singapore to Burma, the same templates were used. Hospitals were instruments of morale. A wounded soldier who wrote home about pain or abandonment could face discipline. Nurses were required to screen letters. Black ink was applied to any mention of shortages, amputations, infection, or fear. This was not random cruelty. It was doctrine. The Imperial Army Medical Department issued circulars emphasizing that public confidence in victory depended on the appearance of vigor within the medical sphere. The Home Ministry reinforced this message in magazines, newsreels, and children's textbooks. Japanese citizens saw photographs of spotless wards. Nurses were shown smiling beneath bright windows. The reality, wards overflowing with lice, maggots and tropical wounds, men dying of beriberi because rice shipments had stopped, was locked behind administrative language. Inside the hospitals, the psychological pressure was relentless. Nurses were young. Many were barely out of school when conscripted into service units. Their training manuals stressed that emotional expression was a weakness that endangered national survival. Crying at a bedside could be construed as sabotage. The correct posture was silence, hands folded, eyes lowered. Yet by 1943 the system was already breaking. Shipping losses to American submarines strangled Japan's medical supply chain. Morphine imports collapsed. Quinine for malaria became rationed to the point of absurdity, sometimes one tablet for an entire ward. Surgical thread was reused after boiling. Ether for anesthesia disappeared first from remote garrisons, then from major base hospitals. Official reports did not change. In late 1943, the Army Medical Bureau in Tokyo reported that treatment capacity remained within acceptable operational margins. But clinical logs from Burma recovered after the war, show that some forward hospitals were operating with less than 10% of required medical supplies. Dysentery outbreaks went unrecorded. Tuberculosis wards were labeled recovery units. The system required participation from everyone inside it. Doctors learned how to rewrite death. If a soldier died from untreated pneumonia because penicillin never arrived, the cause was listed as terminal exhaustion. If a ward lost half its patients in a single month, the report did not use the word loss. It used rotation. Nurses lived inside this distortion every day. They cleaned blood from floors without soap. They folded uniforms taken from corpses and reassigned them to new patients. They were forbidden to speak to civilians about the conditions inside the buildings. When families arrived at hospital gates searching for sons or husbands, the standard response was procedural: transferred, released, awaiting transport. By 1944, the gap between reality and representation had become an abyss. American bombers were already crossing the home islands. Japanese cities burned. Yet propaganda photographs still showed intact hospitals with full shelves. The medical system had become a final protective wall, a narrative barrier designed to convince the population that the empire remained whole, that suffering was limited, that the war was still being endured with discipline and dignity. But that wall depended on one fragile thing: silence. And silence cannot survive a year like 1945. The year when hospitals would no longer be able to hide the truth from themselves. That'd be why the winter of 1944, the Japanese medical system was no longer strained. It was disintegrating. The American submarine campaign had severed the arteries of the empire. Hospital ships were sunk. Medical convoys vanished between islands. By December, military doctors in the Philippines were reporting that they had no anesthetics left at all. Surgeries were performed with soldiers held down by orderlies while nurses bit their own sleeves to stay silent. Those reports never reached the public. What did reach Tokyo were numbers without meaning. Patient counts that stayed stable even as wards emptied through death. The Ministry of War continued to assure civilians that medical services remained effective. Newspapers printed articles praising this selfless devotion of nursing units in the Southern Resource Area, never mentioning that in many places nurses had begun foraging for routes outside base perimeters because rice shipments had stopped. In March 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo erased entire districts in a single night. Thousands were burned, suffocated, crushed. Military hospitals inside the city became triage pits. Yet official communications still avoided the word catastrophe. They spoke instead of urban relocation of treatment facilities. Inside the hospitals, the distinction between military and civilian care collapsed. Children arrived with phosphorus burns from incendiaries. Elderly men were carried in from shelters, lungs filled with soot. There were no beds. Patients lay on staircases, on roof landings, on wooden planks balanced across rubble. Nurses were reassigned from surgical wards to sanitation details, scraping blackened skin from concrete floors. The Red Cross in Japan, tightly controlled by the state, was ordered not to issue independent casualty estimates. Their foreign correspondence was restricted. Even after Hiroshima in August, some hospitals were instructed to describe radiation sickness as unknown fever. American intelligence officers, reading intercepted communications, knew something was wrong long before they landed. By July 1945, U.S. Army Medical Corps analysts were warning that Japanese hospital capacity in the home islands had fallen below 40% of projected need. A report prepared for the invasion planning of Operation Downfall stated that Japan's medical infrastructure was incapable of supporting sustained operations or civilian recovery. Yet Japanese nurses were still told to write letters home describing hope. They wrote about cherry blossoms seen through broken windows. They wrote about patients singing patriotic songs even as they coughed blood into cloths that were reused until they fell apart. They were reminded that morale was a medical duty. Then came August. The emperor spoke on the radio on August 15th, 1945. His voice was distant, filtered, unreadable. The word surrender was not spoken, but everyone understood. Orders followed within hours. All hospitals were to secure sensitive materials. Records were to be destroyed. Photographs were to be burned. Anything that could be construed as evidence of neglect, starvation, or internal collapse was to be removed. Nurses carried bundles of paper to courtyard pits. Doctors tore pages from ledgers with hands that had stitched wounds for a decade. Cabinets were emptied not to supply patients, but to erase memory. They believed the occupation would take months to arrive. It took days. By late August, American advanced medical units were already stepping into hospital corridors across Honshu and Kyushu. They came prepared not for resistance, but for scale. They expected wounded soldiers. They expected malnutrition. What they did not expect was absence. Wards without patients. Shelves without medicine. Death rates that could no longer be reconstructed because the paper trail had been deliberately erased. In Yokosuka Naval Hospital, U.S. doctors noted that entire months of patient data were missing. In Osaka, an American surgical team found a children's ward that had been converted into storage for burned records. The propaganda wall had not only hidden suffering from civilians, it had hidden collapse from the system itself. Now American doctors were standing inside empty buildings, trying to calculate losses without numbers, starvation without charts, disease without diagnoses, while Japanese nurses stood nearby, having carried the burden of the lie longer than anyone. And the moment was coming when those nurses would no longer be able to remain silent. The human angle, Japanese nurses. They were not trained to explain themselves. Most of the nurses who met the occupation forces in late August and early September 1945 had been drafted between 1939 and 1943. Their average age was under 24. Many had spent their entire adult lives inside institutional silence, where personal grief was subordinated to collective image. When the American medics entered, the nurses did not cry immediately. They performed habits first. They bowed. They straightened beds that had no patients. They pointed toward empty cupboards as if presenting inventory. Only after questions came did the cracks appear. How many patients have been here last week? Where are the surgical supplies? Why are there no antibiotics in a city of this size? They had no words prepared for this language. Some attempted answers in fragmented English learned from confiscated textbooks. Others remained silent. A few brought out notebooks they had kept secretly, handwritten tallies of deaths that never reached official ledgers. These were not formal records. They were memory made visible. Columns of dates without names. Circles around days when no one survived the night shift. The act of producing these notebooks was itself a violation of everything they had been taught. The tactical angle, American medical occupation units. The U.S. Army Medical Corps had anticipated devastation. What they encountered was organizational vacuum. The first hospital inspections were conducted by small teams. One physician, one nurse officer, 2 orderlies. They carried pre-printed assessment forms designed for liberated European facilities, beds per ward, operating capacity, pharmacy inventory, sanitation standards. Those forms assumed the presence of infrastructure. In Japan, they found buildings still standing but functions missing. Surgical theaters without scalpels. Pharmacies stocked with empty glass bottles carefully labeled in kanji. Radiology departments whose machines had been dismantled for scrap metal months earlier. The American teams were not only treating patients. They were reconstructing information systems. They had to rebuild casualty baselines from scratch by interviewing nurses, by examining burial pits, by tracing laundry counts to estimate how many uniforms were passing through per week. Every hospital became an intelligence problem. The psychological angle. Propaganda's final failure for 8 years. Propaganda had insisted that care remained intact. It had defined hospitals as symbols of endurance. Now, when American personnel began photographing wards, those images spread quickly through Japanese civilian channels. Not as propaganda, but as revelation. The people who suffered the most from this rupture were the nurses themselves. They had enforced the silence. They had censored letters. They had used euphemisms and charts. They had absorbed death quietly because the state demanded composure. Now American doctors were asking them to speak, to name diseases, to describe hunger, to explain why wards were empty. It was not the accusations that caused tears. It was the permission. One U.S. nurse officer wrote in her diary that during an inspection near Yokohama, a Japanese head nurse attempted to answer a question about child mortality and simply stopped mid-sentence. She placed both hands on the desk and stared at the floor. After a long pause, she said only, "We were told not to remember." This was not an emotional collapse in the dramatic sense. It was cognitive disintegration. A professional identity built on denial could not survive inquiry. They had spent years presenting an empire that no longer existed. Now the uniform meant nothing. The script was gone. And in that vacuum, the next perspective would surface from the Japanese doctors who had signed the falsified reports themselves. The doctors were older than nurses. Many had been trained before the war, when Japanese medicine was internationally respected. They had studied German surgical texts. Some had published in European journals in the 1930s. When the empire expanded, they were absorbed into the military system and placed beneath layers of ideological command. They did not falsify records out of ignorance. They did it because refusal was insubordination. In September 1945, when American medical officers began opening locked filing rooms, Japanese doctors were ordered to present whatever documentation remained. In many hospitals, only fragments survived. Where gaps were obvious, American staff asked for explanations. The answers were procedural: destroyed in air raid, lost during evacuation, removed under ministry instruction. Those phrases were correct, but they were incomplete. Several Japanese physicians later testified during occupation inquiries that they had kept two sets of logs, one clinical, one political. The clinical logs tracked septic shock, starvation edema, radiation burns. The political logs were sanitized for headquarters. When American officers compare hospital admission registers to burial records maintained by municipal offices, discrepancies were staggering. In some districts, death rates were triple what the official hospital number suggested. The doctors did not argue. They bowed and accepted correction. Their defeat was not loud. It was administrative. The leadership angle, orders from the top. The collapse was not localized. It was systemic. After the emperor's broadcast, the Ministry of War circulated final directives to all medical facilities: preserve order, maintain discipline, avoid confrontation with occupying forces. But they issued no guidance on truth. There was no instruction on how to reconcile 8 years of falsified care with the reality now being documented. This vacuum filtered downward instantly. Hospital directors who had once commanded hundreds of staff were reduced to middlemen between American inspectors and frightened nurses. They had authority over neither. Their signatures still appeared on forms, but the meaning of those signatures had evaporated. One hospital administrator in Nagoya wrote in a personal journal that the empire dissolved in the pharmacy. It was a strange phrase, but accurate. When morphine, quinine, penicillin, and ether were inventoried by Americans, the shelves told a story that imperial rhetoric never could. The moral angle: Red Cross, POW medicine, and the end of distance. During the war, Japanese medical doctrine had drawn sharp distinctions. Military patients were imperial assets. Civilians were obligations. Prisoners of war were administrative burdens. These categories determined treatment priority. After the occupation began, American Red Cross observers dismantled those distinctions. They moved Japanese civilians into wards that had once been reserved for officers. They required Japanese hospitals to open POW medical files. They compared treatment protocols across categories. The disparities were no longer deniable. British and American POWs had been denied antibiotics that were reserved for Japanese officers. Nurses who had been instructed never to show sympathy toward enemy prisoners were now told to assist American medics in treating them. This reversal carried enormous emotional weight. Some nurses had spent years watching foreign prisoners die from infections that could have been treated with minimal supplies. They had recorded those deaths as unavoidable. Now, they were helping resurrect bodies they had once been trained to ignore. This was the moral fracture line of the occupation. Not between nations, but inside individual consciences. The propaganda wall had insisted that compassion was conditional, that loyalty determined worthiness of care. The Americans were not preaching philosophy. They were implementing triage. Everyone was treated. In one Tokyo suburb hospital, a Japanese nurse was observed gently adjusting the blanket of a former Allied POW. When asked later why she had done so, she replied simply, "No one is watching now." The sentence carried the weight of an entire war. What followed next was not a battle. It was an audit that would tear through the remaining administrative scaffolding of the empire and expose, in numbers and dates, how much suffering had been hidden behind the language of honor. That on September 3rd, 1945, 3 days after the formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri, American medical occupation teams received their definitive directive: inspect, inventory, document. This was not a symbolic exercise. It was a forensic operation. Teams were dispatched to naval hospitals at Yokosuka and Kure, Army medical centers in Osaka and Nagoya, and municipal wards across Tokyo's burn districts. Each team carried standardized interrogation forms translated into Japanese. The questions were precise. They did not ask about morale. They asked about bed turnover. They asked about monthly death counts. They asked about what drugs had disappeared and when. In Yokosuka Naval Hospital, Lieutenant Colonel Robert H. Stevens of the U.S. Army Medical Corps opened the first intact ledger he had seen since landing. It covered only 12 days in July 1945. The pages were immaculate. Too immaculate. No marginal notes. No corrections. Every cause of death was recorded as acute exhaustion. Stevens requested the corresponding burial logs from the city office. The burial log showed 87 interments for the same period. The hospital ledger showed 23 deaths. No one disputed the discrepancy. At Osaka Army Hospital No. 2, American inspectors discovered that operating room usage logs ended abruptly on June 19, 1945. The room itself bore signs of continued use: blood residue on floorboards, a rusted anesthesia mask still hanging from a hook. When asked why documentation stopped, the Japanese surgical chief replied that all records after June had been destroyed for safety. The answer was correct in form, but not in substance. In Kobe, an American nurse officer found a locked cabinet behind a linen storage room. Inside were loose sheets of paper, not official forms, but personal notes written in different hands. They listed names followed by small circles or crosses. The nurse who had hidden them was present when the cabinet was opened. She did not look up. These inspections were not confrontations in the cinematic sense. There were no raised voices. The power was in paper, in aligning one document with another until the spaces between them became impossible to ignore. At Yokohama Municipal Hospital, Americans reconstructed casualty rates by tracing laundry logs. The number of uniforms processed each week had dropped sharply in July. Not because fewer soldiers were arriving, but because there were no replacements for the dead. At Nagoya, penicillin inventory was cross-referenced with septic ward admissions. The numbers did not align. Penicillin had been recorded as available long after shipments had ceased. Nurses admitted, quietly, that the bottles had been empty for months. The propaganda wall had not fallen yet, but it was cracking. The final breach came not from documents, but from a map. An American epidemiology officer overlaid hospital catchment zones with firebombing patterns from March to August 1945. He calculated the civilian casualty flow into military hospitals after the Tokyo raids. The math did not work. There were thousands of people missing from the clinical picture, not because they had survived, because they had never been counted. On September 8th, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers issued a directive requiring all Japanese hospitals to submit complete casualty estimates from January 1944 onward, regardless of prior reporting categories. For the first time in the war, Japanese medfacilities were ordered to report not for morale, not for image, but for truth. Hospital directors convened emergency meetings. They had nothing to submit. The numbers they had transmitted for years were inventions. The numbers they had destroyed could not be recreated. Nurses were asked to remember. Remember how many beds were filled in June. Remember how many bodies passed through the night shift in July. Remember which wards were closed first and why. This was the moment when tears began to appear. Not in public, not in front of cameras, but in filing rooms where staff attempted to rebuild histories from fragments of memory. An American doctor wrote later that he had never seen people asked to reconstruct loss under such conditions. There were no memorials, no rituals, only tables, forms, and the weight of 8 years of silence pressing down onto blank columns. The wall was no longer standing. It was being dismantled piece by piece. And the next phase would expose not only the scale of what had been hidden, but who had been ordered to hide it.B. Why the third week of September, American Medical Occupation Headquarters in Tokyo had established a centralized review board for Japanese hospital submissions. The flow of paperwork became a torrent. Incomplete forms, reconstructed tallies, handwritten estimates produced under the pressure of impossible expectations. Patterns emerged. Hospitals reported months where death counts spiked suddenly, then vanished. Entire categories of disease were missing. Starvation was almost never listed, yet weight loss charts showed declines so steep that physicians could calculate caloric intake from them alone. The review board began summoning Japanese medical administrators for clarification. These were not trials. They were technical hearings, but the effect was seismic. At a session held on September 22nd, a former Imperial Army medical colonel was asked why casualty reports from the Kanto region showed stable survival rates during the same period that rice rationing fell below subsistence levels. He did not deny the discrepancy. He explained the directive chain. Orders had come from the Army Medical Bureau. Those orders had been shaped by guidance from the Home Ministry. The objective was consistent. Avoid language that suggested institutional failure. Maintain civilian confidence. Prevent defeatist sentiment. The logic had been simple. Truth was dangerous. Once this was said aloud, the structure collapsed. American officers requested copies of ministry circulars. Japanese administrators, now without protection from imperial authority, complied. The documents revealed a system of coded language, a lexicon designed to neutralize catastrophe. Death by malnutrition was categorized as systemic fatigue. Infection from untreated wounds was complication of service. These phrases have been repeated so often they no longer sounded false inside the system. But to outsiders, reading them against burial statistics and eyewitness accounts, the distortion was unmistakable. The confrontation that changed everything occurred not in a boardroom, but in a pediatric ward outside Kawasaki. An American medical team arrived to survey facilities reported as operational. They found 32 children suffering from radiation sickness, burns, and malnutrition. Only 12 were listed in hospital admission records. The head nurse, a woman in her early 30s, had kept her own notebook of names. When asked why the children were not recorded, she answered without hesitation. Because we were told children were not part of the war. The sentence dismantled the entire architecture of propaganda in 8 words. It was repeated in translated transcripts. It appeared in internal Allied reports. It circulated quietly through Japanese medical circles. Children were not part of the war. Then why were they dying in its hospitals? That night, American Medical Command ordered all Japanese hospital staff to preserve, not destroy, all remaining documents. Record destruction was classified as obstruction. For the first time, the system that had punished truth now demanded it. Nurses were instructed to submit any personal logs. Doctors were told to provide uncensored disease statistics. Municipal offices were required to cross-check hospital submissions with cremation and burial records. The result was not a single revelation. It was an avalanche. Numbers that had been suppressed began to surface. Starvation-related deaths in mid-1945 were estimated to be at least 4 times higher than wartime reports had indicated. Post-firebombing infection rates had been hidden behind general categories. Radiation illness, never officially recognized during the war, suddenly appeared in hospital ledgers as a discrete condition. In corridors where silence had once been enforced, people now spoke too much. Nurses recounted nights without morphine. Doctors admitted that surgeries had been performed with no anesthesia. Administrators described pressure from superiors to revise monthly figures. The propaganda wall was not torn down by soldiers. It disintegrated because it could no longer be defended. In one Tokyo hospital, a Japanese nurse asked an American officer whether the reports would be published. The officer replied that they would be archived. She nodded and said, "Then it will be enough." She was not seeking vindication. She was seeking an end to erasure. By the end of September, the Allied medical occupation had compiled the first credible nationwide assessment of Japan's wartime medical collapse. It showed a system that had continued to speak in the language of victory while its wards were filling with uncounted dead. The empire had not fallen on the deck of a battleship. It had fallen in hospital filing rooms, where words were finally forced to match bodies. The exposure of falsified medical records did not lead to dramatic arrests or public trials. It led to something more destabilizing: reorganization. In October 1945, the Allied Public Health and Welfare Section began dismantling Japan's military medical command structure. Hospitals that had once answered to the Imperial Army were transferred to civilian control under occupation supervision. The Army Medical Bureau, which had issued the euphemisms that concealed starvation and infection, was dissolved as a separate authority. This transition was administrative on the surface. In reality, it was psychological. For Japanese hospital staff, especially nurses, the change was disorienting. They were no longer required to protect morale. They were required to measure suffering. Bed counts were no longer symbolic. They were operational. Disease categories were no longer filtered. They were explicit. The first complete mortality audits were compiled in November. They were not released to the public. They were circulated internally among occupation medical planners, who were tasked with triaging a nation whose infrastructure had been quietly rotting beneath rhetoric. The numbers revealed patterns that could not be ignored. Tuberculosis cases up more than 250% since 1943. Dysentery endemic in wards that had been declared sanitized. Starvation edema appearing in civilian children at rates consistent with famine. One U.S. epidemiologist noted in a confidential report that Japan's wartime medical statistics appear to have been constructed to preserve ideology rather than life. It was not a condemnation of individuals. It was a diagnosis of a system. Japanese medical administrators were not imprisoned en masse. Instead, they were sidelined. The occupation authorities instituted new reporting protocols modeled on those used in Europe. Forms were redesigned. Nurses were trained to document symptoms rather than interpretations. A ward that lost 5 patients in a night now recorded 5 deaths, not 5 transfers. The effect was immediate. Mortality rates appeared to spike, not because more people were dying, but because people were finally being counted. This had consequences beyond medicine. Japanese newspapers, now operating under occupation censorship in the opposite direction, began cautiously acknowledging civilian suffering. Articles describe hospital shortages in factual language. The phrase systemic fatigue vanished from print. For the first time since 1937, Japanese readers encountered the word io shiko, malnutrition, in connection with their own hospitals. The reaction among nurses was not relief. It was exhaustion. They had survived the war. Now, they had to survive the truth. Many were called upon to give testimony to municipal health offices compiling community-level loss estimates. They were asked to remember names, to recall wards, to reconstruct nights that had blurred into each other through trauma. Several nursing associations petitioned occupation authorities for rest periods and psychological counseling. These requests were modest. They asked only for time away from wards that had become memorials. The numbers that emerged in these months did not form a clean narrative. They contradicted each other. They shifted as archives were rediscovered and personal notebooks surfaced. But the direction was unmistakable. The propaganda wall had not merely hidden suffering. It had amplified it by denying its existence. And as winter approached, with food shortages continuing and hospitals overwhelmed, the question was no longer how Japan had been deceived, but how it would heal with the truth now unavoidable. The next stage of reckoning would not be conducted by occupation officers. It would be carried out by the nurses themselves, as they began to speak publicly for the first time in their lives. That be why early 1946, the cumulative effect of the occupation's audits and inspections had begun to reshape both Japanese medicine and public memory. Nurses who had once carried the weight of silence were now intermediaries between history and humanity. They were asked to testify before municipal committees, to provide first-hand accounts of hospital conditions, and to clarify discrepancies in records. Many did so quietly, without fanfare, haunted by nights of untreated patients and discarded logs. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the scale of disaster revealed a cruel twist. Hospitals that had survived conventional bombing were now treating radiation casualties previously unrecorded. Nurses who had worked tirelessly during the firebombing were now facing the same children and adults whose symptoms had been ignored. They kept meticulous notes under American supervision, recording exposure, burns, and nutritional status. These records became the foundation for Japan's first post-war epidemiological studies. The Japanese Red Cross, previously constrained by wartime directives, now operated under Allied guidance. Its personnel worked to standardize care across former military and civilian facilities. Former nurses were recruited as instructors, teaching new protocols emphasizing transparency, record-keeping, and impartial care. The hierarchy of treatment, officer, soldier, civilian, prisoner, was formally abolished. Morale remained important, but it was no longer weaponized to obscure death and disease. Nurses' testimonies extended beyond professional circles. Newspapers cautiously published interviews, photographs, and stories documenting hospital conditions. One article described a nurse recounting, with trembling hands, the nights she had to improvise morphine doses from dwindling supplies. Another highlighted the diary of a head nurse who had secretly recorded children dying from malnutrition. These accounts shocked the public, revealing the extent of hidden suffering and the human cost of maintaining appearances. Some nurses emigrated from the profession, unable to reconcile their experiences with post-war expectations. Others stayed, becoming pioneers in occupational medicine and hospital administration. Their influence shaped Japan's post-war healthcare system, embedding rigorous reporting standards, ethical oversight, and humanitarian principles into what had once been a militarized structure. The occupation authorities compiled reports that combined statistical analysis with qualitative testimony. These reports would inform not only immediate post-war aid, but long-term policy. They highlighted the psychological toll on medical staff, the dangers of propagandized reporting, and the importance of accurate public health communication. By 1947, a year after the initial inspections, the narrative had shifted. Hospitals were no longer monuments to national endurance. They were recognized as sites of survival and suffering, of ethical compromise and resilience. Nurses, doctors, and administrators have been forced to confront decades of deception and to participate in rebuilding a system where truth, however painful, was the guiding principle. The dismantling of the propaganda wall had lasting consequences. It established a precedent. No medical system could be left unaccountable. No record could be altered to shield ideology from reality. For the nurses who had once stood silently beside empty beds, it was both a burden and a release. The weight of concealment lifted, replaced by the responsibility to ensure history remembered the cost accurately. The events of 1945 and 1946 did not end suffering. Shortages persisted. Hospitals remained under pressure. But the human and institutional acknowledgement of truth created a foundation for recovery. The collapse of the empire's final propaganda wall revealed the fragility of systems built on denial and the enduring strength of those who survived them. The last propaganda wall did not fall with gunfire or surrender papers. It fell quietly, in corridors where empty beds and hollow cupboards spoke louder than any official statement. Japanese nurses, once the guardians of silence, became witnesses to truth, a truth so stark that it reshaped the very understanding of what the empire had protected and what it had hidden. History often remembers battles, bombings, and declarations. Yet here, the decisive confrontation was administrative, ethical, and deeply human. Nurses who had spent years enforcing ideology were now forced to measure suffering, to reconcile memory with fact. Doctors who had written euphemisms were asked to account for every omission. And American medics, trained for field medicine, became archivists of truth. The collapse revealed more than statistics. It revealed the fragility of systems built on denial. It revealed that propaganda, no matter how pervasive, cannot indefinitely erase human experience. Those who endure it, the nurses, the patients, the silent observers, carry the consequences visible in trembling hands, whispered recollections, and reconstructed ledgers. Yet in this reckoning, there was also resilience. The same nurses who had once hidden death learned to document it. They became agents of accountability, of reform, and of historical preservation. Their work laid the foundation for post-war medical ethics in Japan, for transparent reporting, and for a system where humanity could not be subordinated to ideology.